everyone, I'm Brent Skaggs.
And I'm Kimble.
Today we're going to be talking to you about human trafficking beyond borders, challenges for public security in the transnational digital world. We apologize for not being able to be there with you today, but we have recorded this presentation ahead of time. We hope the presentations and conference are going well for you. And Dr. Lasavio and El Maghrabi have been gracious enough to answer questions for us.
Thank you.
So before we start the broader presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what sex trafficking and human trafficking is, and a little bit about what it entails. So trafficking in general can be thought about as holding a person or an individual and coercing them to do something that they don't necessarily want to do. And you can coerce them, you can force them, punish them for not doing those things. And traffickers operate at a domestic level, so within a country, and they also operate at an international level and transport victims across countries' borders. And so you see trafficking happening in a variety of industries such as construction, manufacturing, industrial fishing, agriculture, and so on. And traffickers often force their victims to work, and a few of the ways they may, ensure that the victims don't run away, or that they continue to do the work that the traffickers want, whether that be sex work or labor trafficking or what have you, is by removing their identification papers. So if a victim is in another country, they may not be familiar with that country, and they may not speak the language even. And so if the trafficker takes their identification papers, they will often feel lost and feel like they'll be imprisoned if they try to go to the authorities. And then for a domestic level, and in some cases international level, the traffickers often try to remove victims from their support systems as well. And you especially see this in sex trafficking, where victims are isolated from their family and friends, from their loved ones, and they are threatened, beaten, and generally just intimidated, so that they feel like they have to stay with the trafficker for fear of what may happen to them or their families if they leave. And so these traffickers use these technologies to recruit and maintain their hold over victims. And so that's what we're going to be talking to you about today.
Okay, so as you can see with our first slide here, the digital age has done very much for us. And so, how the digital age has influenced sex trafficking is that it has increased the traffickers' reach and anonymity, as well as the buyer's selection. And if you think about how we've become so interconnected and available to immediately share information, provide services to each other, think about what that has done to the average sex trafficker. So their reach has expanded. They can often utilize all these sites. They can utilize the burner phone. They can utilize areas in the deep web. And we'll talk more about a lot of these later. And on top of that, tracing the activity has become so much more difficult because there is often ways to hide the identity utilizing services such as encryption, dark nets, and much more. And this really complicates things further because new kinds of currency, especially Bitcoin, have come along to really mix things up. And then we look at the buyer's point of view. Buyers are able to share information on their experience with victims and whether or not it was pleasant. They can also review the trafficker's services from a business standpoint. Was the service discreet, easy to set up, and whatnot? And this in turn has led to more accessibility for the traffickers to look out for potential victims and often coerce potential victims into setting up a meeting, which would in turn cause the victim to almost certainly lose everything they might have been going for in life.
So the digital age has influenced sex trafficking and sex traffickers' reach and anonymity, and it's also influenced the ability of researchers and law enforcement to track and make efforts towards prevention of sex trafficking and human trafficking in general. So researchers are able to analyze data on the surface web, and when we say the surface web, we mean in this context sites that you can get to from Google, Yahoo, or Bing. So various search results you might access from a search engine. Law enforcement can use tools such as Spotlight, which is a software that we'll discuss later on, but it's essentially a data aggregation software and machine learning, and it utilizes machine learning. And then Memex is a software, and it has various libraries and other packages that add on to it, which allows for data mining in the deep web. And so all of those things to serve to illustrate that technology can be used to prevent human trafficking and sex trafficking, as well as what traffickers are using to enhance that.
Okay, and so while we're on this slide, I'll go ahead and explain the difference between the deep web and the dark web. So the deep web, in contrast to the surface web, is the sites that are not indexed by search engines. Although these sites are not indexed by search engines, you do not require any special configurations to access these sites as long as you have the proper authentication in place and the user credentials that you'll need. The dark web refers to the part of the deep web that requires specific configurations to access, such as Tor, which we'll actually discuss later.
So as we talked about, with traffickers, they have been able to utilize a number of information and communication technologies to increase their reach in trafficking for both labor trafficking and as well as sex trafficking. So burner phones are utilized by traffickers as a way to connect with potential buyers, and sometimes connect to potential victims, and then they can get rid of that phone without a trace. And burner phones are especially difficult to track because of the fact that you can obtain them without any identification, and you can buy them in cash, and really the only way to track that information is you can track it down to about an area code, and that's about it for that. And then Backpage.com and the deep web are two ways that traffickers might advertise their victims, and in some cases, for Backpage, that they may even advertise as a way to lure victims in, because a lot of times with especially international sex trafficking and human trafficking, victims are lured in by false job postings. So if a student, young girl, young boy, a teenager wants to see the world and wants to go live in Paris or go to Canada or what have you, if they see a job posting somewhere, they might think it's a great opportunity, and then when they get to this country where they don't know anybody, they may not speak the language, they find out that it was all a ploy in order to hold them and use them for labor trafficking. So they're essentially sold into slavery, or sex trafficking, where essentially they're sold into sex slavery.
Okay, so here we have one of the older U of L studies that was performed on Backpage, which looked at the area codes and the phone numbers that were posted on Backpage, and what we were seeing was that in a certain concentrated area of Louisville, Kentucky, we were seeing a wide distribution of area codes that spread throughout the entire United States. And if you look particularly in Nevada and Las Vegas, you can actually see that these Louisville area codes were able to span and aggregate in very certain areas of the country. And Las Vegas in particular is known for having different laws regarding prostitution and other things. And
yeah, so what this map illustrates is that there are a wide number of areas that victims are being advertised on, or from rather. So a trafficker may post something with an area code from Las Vegas, as Shane mentioned, from the Mexico border. If you look down in the Texas area in the middle of the map in the southern part of it, or in California, which is on the west side, the west coast. There are ads coming from those areas and being posted for Louisville, Kentucky, which suggests that the traffickers are moving around either themselves or they're moving their victims around, and so that all they're tied to is that area code. So we can assume that the area code is where they originated from. So this illustrates what we're referring to when we talked about the surface web and the deep web. And the surface web is going to be, as I mentioned, where you can get with Google, Bing, Yahoo, and the traffickers at that level would be something that, like we discussed, or like we mentioned with victims being lured in from false job postings. A lot of time traffickers will hang out in chat rooms, and this especially applies to sex trafficking. They will hang out in chat rooms and try to entice victims in that way. Use social media, Twitter, Facebook. All of these platforms have been used to try to lure victims in, and then ultimately they're then sold and they are trafficked for various buyer selections on web pages such as Backpage.com.
all right, and so as you go lower into the picture, you can see journals and databases seem to be a pretty neutral area. And then when you get to the very bottom, we get to Tor. And keep in mind, at the Tor level, this is implying that we're at the dark web. And so to the left of the Tor, you can see more traffickers. And although this could imply the customer-trafficker relationship, this is often also thought as an area to conduct more of the business operations in private. But often you'll see that the surface web and the deep web and the dark web all share very important connections regarding human trafficking. And oftentimes, when you refer back to some of our previous slides, you saw that all of these are connected. You'll often see the same burner phone numbers appear almost all over the place, especially when you begin to use the data aggregation software such as Memex and Thorn. You'll often see these connections pointing from the surface web to the deep web and vice versa.
And so, in addition to the traffickers on this illustration, we also see some other parts of the deep web that are not as nefarious. So it's important to note that the deep web houses other things in addition to sites where you could potentially buy human or purchase illegal weapons. So journals and databases are also some of the things that are located on the deep web, and so you wouldn't necessarily want those to be accessed from Google or Yahoo. You don't want your online bank account to be accessed from a search website, from a search engine, and you don't want academic journals always necessarily to be accessed from those sites either, because they may be behind a paywall and may need subscriptions. So, in regards to solutions to prevent trafficking, we've seen a couple of technologies really really combat trafficking in general, and one of those is Spotlight, which was created by the nonprofit Thorn. And Spotlight is focused specifically on stopping the sex trafficking of minors. And so Spotlight is available for all U.S. law enforcement agencies, and it works in a way so that it aggregates data and utilizes machine learning to parse language and really examine and help law enforcement prioritize which leads they should follow. So, for instance, if a posting potentially held a minor, or a trafficker that was advertising a minor, then the Spotlight software would help law enforcement to prioritize and figure out if that was something that they should put resources behind investigating, or if there are other cases that they should maybe investigate first.
Alright, and so Mimics has some similarities to Spotlight in that it utilizes data aggregation and machine learning algorithms to understand data and drive investigations and research further. Although one of the primary differences is that it's utilizing domain-specific searching and indexing, and the reason why we choose to cover it more is because it has been open sourced mostly, and it has a crowdsourcing initiative which allows us to understand it better as researchers. And so, I can go ahead and read to you this quote here. We've started with one domain, the human trafficking domain. In the end, we want it to be useful for any domain of interest. And again, this refers back to the domain-specific search and indexing. And so what you need to keep in mind here is that when we say domain-specific search and index, that is in contrast to text-based search, which is the primary search utilized by the surface web search engines such as Google, Yahoo, and Bing. So in a text-based search, what you're doing is the user types in their search their words into the search bar, and what will happen is the search engine will just take those words and immediately match those words to the page that is most clicked on in the search engine. So if you type in YouTube, for instance, it's going to most likely take you to the YouTube that you know. And when you look at domain-specific search and index, on the other hand, this takes information known about that kind of domain or category, and what it will do is it'll limit everything else despite what you type. So what you type into the search engine at this point will limit your scope in a more computer science controlled fashion. And as you can see on the right, the lower right triangle here, this is pointing to the origins of the program. So this program was founded by DARPA, which stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and this is an agency of the Department of Defense, and it's come a long way since then. And so, as you can see here, this is a brief history of the word mimics, where it comes from and where it is now. And so, the top picture refers to Vannevar Bush, who was the one who pioneered the idea of mimics, and this was before the invention of the personal computer. So what he had in mind was an invention that would allow the cataloging, organization, and visualization of vast amounts of data and information. And as you can see in the description here, photographs, pictures, letters, anything that you would want to be displayed to you easily and easily interpreted, ready to work. And many years later, you can see in the bottom picture, we have a web browser open, and it's running as its own web server on top of this program. And as we'll see later, the program is very advanced in technology. It utilizes a whole lot of areas of computer science to drive its functions. So you can see in the picture here, we're creating a lot a lot of nodes that are extracted from any information found in these advertisements, and what it will do with this information is link it to anything else it can find. And so, as you can see with this chart here, what we're doing is we're separating academia, government, and others, which would include people who just want to help, private businesses, open source teams, etc. And so on the upper right, we have the founder of the program, which is DARPA, and we also have the U.S. Naval Research Laboratories and NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And these teams seem somewhat unrelated to what you would want to do with human trafficking, but the thing is, this technology and the goal of fighting human trafficking often goes further beyond just limiting your scope to a specific part of what could be a bigger problem. And so these researchers have come on board and done enormous things for the project. At the very bottom, you have the academia, which has helped a lot with the publications and a lot of the journal work. And in the upper left, we see a lot of the teams that have done even more development and provided very specific modifications and functionality to Memex.
So the open source nature and the collaboration are two key aspects of Memex because it hints at the power that is behind this software platform, and it hints at the ability of it to not only work to prevent human trafficking and sex trafficking, but also be able to aggregate data and analyze and organize data in a new way. NASA JPL, is the U.S. Space Agency, and so it's interesting that they would be involved in such a project. But it really speaks to how how Memex is able to organize data in a way that we haven't seen.
And so, as you can see here, this is the brief overview of the main functionality points of Memex. So, as we said, machine learning and data aggregation are some of the main points, but we can briefly touch on each of these sections here. So we can start in the very middle. So API refers to Application Programming Interface, and that will allow the program to build itself by gathering all the building blocks it needs. Machine learning refers to the ability of the program to make its own judgments without the user having to code anything. Analytics is computer-based statistics mainly. Visualization refers to the picture you saw and the connections that are drawn. Infrastructure refers to the organization of all these sub-features of Memex and sub-programs, utilities, tools. Distributed programming refers to distributed computing, which is a sharing of the load across a network in multiple systems. And finally, data collection refers to the ability to crawl websites via web crawlers. And finally, we can move on to our important algorithm here, which is actually maintained by NASA JPL as of this moment. So, on lines 1 through 2, we see input and output. So what we're inputting is the files that we want to compare, and what we want to do with these is to output a score based on the files that we want to score for. So the files that we want to score for are unknown, and the other set of files are the files that we know are evidence of human trafficking. And so on lines 4 through 6, we're going to initialize some variables. So gold set refers to the known evidence of human trafficking. And on lines 8 through 11, for every file, we're going to extract metadata via Tika, which is a plugin that can extract metadata from certain file formats. And in lines 15 through 18, for every file, we're going to get a score for the unknown metadata sets that we want more information, which would indicate human trafficking activity. And in line 13, we have to actually convert data into a sizable format, which will allow us to perform the final mathematical operation, which is this right here. So A intersection B divided by A union B is less than 1. And what this refers to is you're looking for what A and B have in common, which would be your unknown set and your gold set all over everything combined. And your maximum score would be out of 1 or 100%.
And so an easy way to think about what this program is doing is if you envision it like a Venn diagram. So you have two circles, and the circles are overlapping in some section. And the circle on the left would be your gold set, and the circle on your right would be your suspect data set. Then the intersection is the similarities that they have, whether that be metadata or what have you. That's the similarities are what we're looking for, because that's what we want to compare the two sets between. And it's important to note that metadata can cover a wide array of things when we're discussing topics such as suspected sex trafficking and human trafficking. The metadata from photos can be anything from whether the flash was used, the make and model of the camera, the color profile, in some cases even the owner of the camera. Okay. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us at the email address listed here. And thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.